Good afternoon and welcome. We are so glad that you are here with us for this Zoom meeting and course on troublesome plants and identification and controlling those. My name is Amy Brashears. I'm an MU Extension Community Engagement Specialist in Ag Business, and I am going to share my screen to start our presentation and introduce our speaker. All right, welcome to Troublesome Weeds, Top 5 Plant Pests in the Pasture, Backyard, and Roadside, Identifying and Controlling Common Missouri Plant Pests. I'm delighted to introduce to you today Travis Harper, one of my colleagues with MU Extension, an agronomist. And Travis, we're grateful to have covering Benton County. We've got his contact information there, and it will also be repeated later in this course. His areas of expertise are plant ID, soils analysis, private pesticide applicator license training, row crops, forages, and home horticulture, and beekeeping, and so much more. So welcome, Travis, and we will turn this over to you.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Amy kind of had the idea to do a program on some of the weeds that she'd been seeing and had been asked about, so I've tried to cover a few of those there, certainly the ones that I see most often and get asked about most often, but Amy may have some that she wants to mention as well. And of course, with the group being as small as it is, I think we're going to have plenty of time and opportunity to address any particular weed issues that anyone may have. So that being said, I think we'll go ahead and get started with our first weed. Amy, if you'll go ahead and advance that slide, please. All right, so this by far is the most common weed that I get asked about on a regular basis. It's called Sericea Lespedeza. And a little bit about it, it was introduced from Asia back in the 1940s or so. In some places it was introduced as a potential grazing plant, and in others it was introduced as sort of a soil erosion prevention type of plant. And it turns out that it wasn't really good at either one of those things, but it is really good at spreading. So Sericea Lespedeza can be found in pastures, of course, ground, roadsides, conservation areas, just about anywhere, with the exception of it's typically not going to be found in row crop ground or in lawns that are regularly maintained. So the thing with Sericea Lespedeza is that it does really well on our poor soils, our heavy clay, thin organic matter topsoil soils. It does really well. It doesn't need a lot of fertility, doesn't need a lot of help for it to thrive. Another problem with it is that the plant, as it matures, gets to be high in tannins. And these high tannins make it unpalatable to cattle. Now, small ruminants like sheep and especially goats will eat Sericea Lespedeza just about any time. And if you've got those kind of livestock in a pasture, they do a pretty good job of keeping it under control. But in cattle pastures, not so much. And because they won't eat it, this plant is allowed to mature and produce seed, and it is a prolific seed producer. If you just look in that picture there on the right-hand side and try to guess or count how many Sericea Lespedeza stems that we see, well, each one of those stems produces about 10,000 seeds. And those seeds are viable in the ground for a good 4 to 5 years. And because they produce so many seeds, when we start out with one plant in an area, the next year there's a lot more, and it continues to increase and grow until eventually it's taken over the majority of our pasture. So spraying a herbicide is about the only way to really get good, effective control on this particular weed. We're specifically looking for herbicides that contain a specific chemical called triclopyr, and I've listed those there on the slide: Pasture Guard, Cimarron, or Remedy Ultra. Now, Sericea Lespedeza is different again in that most weeds, we try to control them when they're as small or short as possible, and Sericea Lespedeza is different. We don't spray Sericea Lespedeza until it gets to be at least 12 inches tall, which in Missouri that happens usually in June. And we can spray from that time all the way through to the period of bud to flowering on the plant, which is typically going to be in August. Now, because this produces a lot of seed and because the seed lasts 4 to 5 years, sometimes longer, it typically is going to take 3-4 years or more of spraying to really get this under control in a field. And if we don't have any questions about Sericea Lespedeza, I think we'll move on to the next weed. All right. So this one is Perilla Mint, and it's also known as beefsteak plant. Depending on if you're talking more about a horticulture type situation, you'd probably call it beefsteak, or if you're talking out in a pasture or field, probably call it Perilla Mint. Now, typically this was only found in sort of natural type areas, wooded areas, that sort of thing, shaded areas. We didn't find it in open fields very much. Well, that has changed. In the last 5 to 10 years, we've started to see Perilla Mint move out away from these shaded sort of natural areas and more into our pastures and hay fields. And that's a big problem for us because Perilla Mint is toxic. So if you've got cattle, any kind of grazing livestock, and you've got this Perilla Mint, you certainly want to be very careful. Now, in terms of identification, it is a mint, and all plants in the mint family have a square stem. Okay, and no other type of plant has a square stem. So that's a good, easy way to identify this plant by checking to see if it has a square stem. You're certainly, like I said, going to see it sort of more in the shaded areas and creeping out into the edge of the field rather than in the middle of a pasture or hay field. And certainly when you walk through an area where there's a lot of it, like in that picture on the bottom right there, you're even going to get the mint smell. Now, livestock typically are not going to eat this plant as long as there are other things out there in the field for them to consume. About the only time they're going to eat it is if we're in really serious drought conditions, middle of summer, pastures are stressed and overgrazed, and this may be the only thing out there green and growing, and then they might eat it then, and that's when it really becomes a problem for us. Another time it becomes a problem is when it comes time to cut hay. If we cut hay with this stuff in it, allow it to dry out, and then feed that hay later in the winter, this plant is still toxic to livestock. And they're more likely to eat it in hay than they are to graze it out in the field. So hay producers, when they're cutting their hay, they should drive around or avoid harvesting, cutting in areas where they've got pretty good sized stands of Perilla Mint. Fortunately, it's fairly easy to control. When it's young, shorter, we use chemicals like 2,4-D or Grazon. As it starts to get more mature, we have to look at chemicals with a little bit more kick, something like a Remedy Ultra. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So this one is Johnsongrass, and Johnsongrass, there's a little bit of debate on it because Johnsongrass actually is a fairly decent livestock forage. In fact, it's, in terms of quality, it's about the same as tall fescue, which makes up the majority of the forages that we have in the state. But there's some big problems with Johnsongrass. One, because it is a warm season annual grass, it's highly prone to being a potential source of nitrate poisoning. And what that means is that anytime we have pastures or hay fields where we fertilize with nitrogen fertilizer, if we do that in the spring and then it becomes a drought later on into the summer, then high levels of nitrogen will accumulate in the stem and leaves of these types of plants, including Johnsongrass. And if the cattle go out and graze it and they eat enough and the nitrate levels are high, it can certainly be deadly to livestock. So we have to be very careful if we do have Johnsongrass in a field and we're under drought conditions. The other issue with Johnsongrass is in the fall, early winter, after we have our first hard frost. So when we have Johnsongrass standing in a field and we have our first hard frost, immediately after that, a chemical called prussic acid develops inside the plant. And that chemical is toxic. In fact, it's the same thing as cyanide. So if animals were to consume this, they would suffer from cyanide poisoning, which certainly could include death. So we had to be very careful with this plant, both in the summertime and then right after a frost. Now, Johnsongrass is a tough one. It can show up in, natural areas, roadsides, pastures, hayfields, row crop ground, even lawns or other areas that maybe aren't mowed quite as often. So it can be found about anywhere. And even if you do a pretty good job at mowing it, keeping it short, this plant still spreads and spreads primarily by rhizomes, which makes it very difficult to kill. The other issue with Johnson grass is that it is a grass, which means if we spray a herbicide that will kill Johnson grass, it will also kill any other grass that we have around that area that we're spraying. So if we make efforts to control Johnson grass, usually what we end up doing is we end up spot spraying a non-selective herbicide, something like a glyphosate, or you might know it by the brand name Roundup. We'll spot spray the Johnson grass. Good job of killing it. We know it's going to kill some of the plants surrounding it, and we just live with that. Now, if we have Johnson grass that's quite a bit more widespread and we're needing to treat a large area, then we're pretty well left with what's called a wiper bar application. And that's basically a horizontal bar with sort of a sponge type material on it that we attach to the front of an ATV or a UTV. It's a cylinder, this wiper bar is, and we fill that cylinder up with a non-selective herbicide like Roundup, and we drive across the field wiping the glyphosate on the Johnson grass, but not having it come in contact with our desirable plants. And this works out very well, primarily because Johnson grass, especially in the summertime, tends to rapidly outgrow our other grass plants and will be quite a bit taller. So we can wipe with that wiper bar, get it on the Johnson grass, without getting it on our desirable plants. Now you'll see there on the side that Johnson grass does have an asterisk behind it, and you'll see that a couple more times in this presentation. And what that means is that this plant is actually on the Missouri noxious weed list. And what that means, it's a Missouri state law, and it basically says if you have this on your property, you're required to make efforts to control it to the best of your ability. All right, next slide, please. All right, thistles. I think everybody knows thistles. We can have them everywhere: row crop, forage, side of the road, lawn, garden. Thistles are one of the most common weeds that we have in Missouri. There's several different types: musk thistle, bull thistle, Scotch thistle. There's a lot of different types. The majority of the time, the one that we're dealing with here in Missouri is called the musk thistle. Now you can see it's in its mature stage right there. So a musk thistle, or any thistle, is a biennial plant. And that means during the first year, the seed germinates, it grows as a rosette or stays very low to the ground. Then during the second year, it sends up a seed stalk and puts out these flowers and produces a lot of seed. And just like Sericea Lespedeza, this is really a prolific seed producer. So if you've got it in one area and nothing is done about it, then pretty soon you're going to see that area get larger, and you're going to see thistles spread to adjacent areas of a property. How do we control it? Well, it's actually easy to kill if we spray it at the right time. So we want to spray it in the rosette stage before it sends up that stalk that you see in the picture right there. So remember, biennial plant. First year, it's rosette, and it's the rosette all the way through the spring of the second year, and then the spring of the second year, it sends up that stalk. So we want to spray it when it's in the rosette, which means in the fall of the first year, sometime around October, or in the spring of the second year before it sends up that stalk. It's typically going to be April. We spray it then. They're really easy to kill. A lot of landowners have spent a lot of time riding around on their four-wheelers just looking for thistles and spraying them. Now, once they have put this flower head out there, it's not worth your time or money to spray them. You're not going to be able to control them, and you're certainly not going to be able to produce them from prevent them from producing viable seed. So once they get to this point, like we see in the picture, what we're left with is allowing the musk thistle weevil to do its job. So many decades ago, an insect called the musk thistle weevil was released across the country. And these weevils actually feed on the seed head of thistle plants and prevent that plant from producing viable seed. And so once they get to this flowering point, that's our only option. We rely on those weevils. Now, the weevils are just like any other predator. When we have a lot of thistles, then the musk thistle weevil populations really build up high very quickly and do a great job at controlling the thistles, and then the thistles sort of disappear for a while. And because the thistles have disappeared, then the weevils disappear. And then eventually the thistles come back, and then the weevils follow along, but there's a little bit of a lag there. So it's definitely a cyclical type plant that we have to deal with. A lot of people ask about mowing this once they see these flower heads, and you cannot mow often enough to prevent it from producing viable seeds. So we either spray during the rosette stage or we rely on the weevil once it's flowering. Next slide, please.
Travis, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
And that is, do you recommend a certain kind of spray for thistles or a variety maybe?
Yeah, so we have a lot of sort of pasture, hay ground, those types of herbicides available, and it can be pretty confusing, but it's actually a lot more simple than what it appears. So basically we have plants that are really immature, and then plants that are mature or may have a woody stem. And any plant that we spray in the mature stage in the immature stage is really easy to kill. So if we're spraying thistles in the immature stage, we're typically going to use about our cheapest broadleaf herbicide option, which is 2,4-D. And the same is true of all broadleaf weeds that are short, immature, young. They're real easy to kill with 2,4-D. Now, once we talk about plants that are more mature, that have started to flower or may have a woody stem, then we typically look for a chemical that has sort of an additional kick and some residuals. So thistles, when they're in the rosette stage, they're really easy to kill. So usually we use our most economical broadleaf herbicide option, which is 2,4-D. Next slide, please. And thistles, of course, are on the Missouri Noxious Weed list as well. So poison hemlock. This is another one kind of like Perilla Mint in that usually we only found it sort of in more shady creek bottom type areas, but in recent years has more spread out into pastures, hayfields, and things like that. It's even more toxic than Perilla Mint. It's highly toxic, and in fact, if you are trying to remove this by hand or weed eat it, and you get it on your skin and you're allergic to poison ivy, you're probably going to have a reaction to poison hemlock as well. So it's highly toxic. It's a biennial, just like the thistle. Meaning that it's in the rosette stage first year, second year it produces stems and flowers and seeds, and we want to spray it in that rosette stage, once again in the fall of the first year, October, or in the spring of the second year, April. Now, the way to distinguish poison hemlock from a number of other weeds that we have, it looks very similar to a lot of other weeds, but really the way to identify it, if we look at the stem in the upper picture there, you can see some purple spots or purple stains on the stem, and that's pretty much indicative of poison hemlock. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so those were the 5 that I picked out. Amy may want to jump in at this point and mention some that these, but those are the 5 that certainly from just how common they are, and also the fact that some of them tend to be poisonous. Those certainly the ones that I get asked the most about. Besides those, the other most common weeds that I get asked about: buckbrush, blackberries, cocklebur was big this year, locust, multiflora rose, foxtail, hemp dogbane was a big one this year as well, and then ragweeds. And I will turn it back over to Amy.
Okay. First of all, we'd like to ask if there are any questions or if you have a common plant maybe that you're dealing with. I know my husband and I have a cow-calf farm, and we have, other than unfortunately some of the weeds that Travis mentioned, we also have quite a bit of multiflora rose, and that keeps us pretty busy keeping an eye on that. And depending on where you are around the state, we were kind of looking at Benton County and what might be here. But there might be some other weeds that you have that might be a problem. I would also call your attention to the picture that's on the right here. And that is an MU publication for integrated pest management, weed and brush control. And that's a publication that's available from the university. And we also do have it here in our Benton County office if someone would be interested. And I highly recommend that book. I am definitely a novice as far as this goes. Travis is your expert and I'm the novice, but I have really enjoyed reviewing my copy. The color pictures are great. There's a lot of good content that's easy to read and divided up in ways that make sense, and plenty of tables and that sort of thing to help you figure out what you need to do to control weed and brush plants that are a pest, and also to use the index in the book to find the plant that you're looking for easily. So I'll go ahead and say, please feel free to contact Travis. He's always interested in your questions, and we really appreciate his knowledge and ability that he shares with us. His email address is here, harpertw@missouri.edu, and he can be reached at 660-885-5556. Again, his areas of expertise, among others, are plant ID, soils analysis, private pesticide applicator license training, row crops, forages, and home horticulture, and beekeeping. And one that's not listed is he's also our Benton County Master Gardener sponsor, and we are really grateful for all the great work that he does there. If you are interested in contacting MU Extension in Benton County, you can reach us at bentonco@missouri.edu, 660-438-5012. Our mailing address is P.O. Box 969, Warsaw, Missouri, 65355. And our physical address is 100 West Washington. That's also in Warsaw. We do have copies of the Weed and Brush Control book, and we would be happy to sell you one of those. And I would again highly recommend that as a resource as a practicing cow-calf family farmer. It's been a great resource for us. With that, if you have any questions, we would love to answer those. And if not, we thank you for attending our presentation. We are planning on sharing this recording with everybody who attended, and we're also exploring options about making it available to the general public. So I'd like to once again thank Travis for his expertise and his willingness to jump in and do this presentation for us, for all the preparation he put in and the good information that he shared. Okay, I see that Holly has a question. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see what else is going on. Okay, Holly, I don't know if you want to chat or if you want to talk, but the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, guys. I'm James, Holly's husband. We appreciate the informative here. What we're after, or what we're doing, we're new to the cow. We've bought some cattle. We're currently buying 80 acres, and we're wanting to hay a certain part of it. So what would be kind of I guess I'm trying to ask, what would be like a common thing to do in preparation as far as prepping it for a haying application? Or is there like a general preparation that you would suggest, Travis?
That's a good question. So is it already planted in the grass that you're wanting to make hay out of?
Well, we're just acquiring the property next week, so we're a little early. we're going to get on there, and we was going to contact a local gentleman that sprays and try to get some input from him. But we were just trying to get a plan laid out, you know, just so once we acquire it, we can kind of get going and not run out of season or run out of time to get it prepared for next year. So.
Absolutely. So I'll give you a general plan. And of course, I make farm visits as well. So if you ever want me out there to look and see what you got and talk in a little bit more detail about sort of a plan of what needs to be done, I'd be certainly happy to do that.
Oh, awesome.
In general, once we're getting a new property and we're going to look at improving it or redirecting it towards a certain goal, the two things that we really want to start out with is we need to sort of assess what plants we've got out there, what forages, what desirable forages, how much of a weed issue we've got, all that sort of thing. So we need to kind of look at that. And the other thing we need to do right away is we need to get soil tests taken. Okay. So the reason why we have weeds more than any other reason by far is generally because of inadequate soil fertility. And it's a big problem, certainly in Missouri and many other parts of the country, is that a lot of forage and hay ground does just not get fertilized like it should. So those are the two things that I would start with, identifying the plants that you've got, the percentages of desirable plants you want to keep, identifying what those weeds are that you want to get rid of, because it does make a big difference on the time of year as to when they're sprayed, and then getting those soil tests done.
Okay. We can just email you and try to set something up like that, I guess.
That'd be absolutely fine. Yes.
Okay. We'll do that, and that kind of helps give us a little direction, and we appreciate both your time today. I thought it was very, very intuitive for us to learn as we go here. So.
Well, it's certainly been our pleasure, and I would encourage you, we will be sending the link, so if there are others that you know that might be interested in this content, then we would love for you to share that and get the word out. Our intent was to make something that was very user-friendly and digestible and kind of for everyday use, and so I really appreciate Travis doing that, and we appreciate you being here, and hope that in the future that you'll reach out to Travis with any questions that you might have. I know he'll be happy to help. And I think with that, unless you have any further questions, we'll wrap this up. And again, thank Travis and thank our attendees, and wish you all a great afternoon.
Nope. Thank you, Amy. We'll touch base with you on getting us a catalog coming on that. So we appreciate your guys' times today. Have a great afternoon, folks.